essentially this chapter and the next one breaks down what he describes as his 10 rules of hate, being the 10 rules that the I guess legacy news media uses to make us hate each other. And so I guess this first rule is a great place to dive in, right? And he says there are only two ideas, right? And this gets into the immediate bifurcation process, that anything that is going to be on what we'll continue to refer to as cable news, because I think that's the most convenient way to get to the idea of what the problem is. Although this is certainly, these problems are not exclusive to cable news. They certainly present themselves in print media and podcasts and independent media as well. But I think they're primarily concentrated, and they're particularly effective and destructive in cable news. So anyway, we'll read this quote and then kind of unpack it. So he says, there are only two ideas. There are only two baskets of allowable opinion: Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative, left or right. This is drilled into us at a young age. By the time we hit college, most of us, roughly speaking, will have chosen the political identity we'll stick with for the rest of our lives. It's the Boolean version of politics, pure binary thought. Blue or red, true or false, 0 or 1.
Yeah, and this is such an accurate point. The media basically enforces the strict confines of the two-party duopoly from the very inception of people's political thinking, presenting them with these two choices and not really even letting them know about other options or potential, alternatives. It directly enforces this, and it's absolutely right. It's a pure binary, blue or red, true or false. Bad or evil and good is another one of these binaries that I think the media really drills into the heads of people. And it's so accurate that it then goes on to enforce and help out the establishment candidates down the line. Obviously, if you can force everyone within these two establishments, and both establishments have a strict leadership that basically is to pick out their candidates, then it makes it that much harder for independent, populist people, grassroots candidates to succeed in the system. So I think if nothing else, this dynamic is truly indicative of how the media just aids and abets establishment politics from day one.
Absolutely, and it kind of goes back to his previous chapter, where I think the silo metaphor is perfectly apt, right? Because we're just completely isolating ourselves from the other opinion. We're over here in this camp, and they're over here in their camp, and we're just consuming what we want to hear, essentially, right? Or rather, it's being fed to us. But yeah, we can go to the next rule. Yeah. The two ideas are in permanent conflict. So this is important, right? He says it was a joke in the 70s with Saturday Night Live's Point Counterpoint. The Saturday Night Live news show pitted Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin viciously railing at each other over issues no sane person could possibly care about. Jane, you ignorant slut, seized Aykroyd in a debate about how actor Lee Marvin's Polymony case. The skit was hilarious precisely because normal human beings don't dress up in suits and ties to yell insults at each other over issues that have nothing to do with their actual lives. He then goes on to make the point that this is essentially what's happening over with our news media now. The issues that are being debated hotly and being contested, by and large, do not actually impact the audience's lives, right? Whereas the things that would, actually impact people's lives, they get no discretion time at all, right? So how are we going to solve the healthcare crisis? How are we going to solve the housing crisis? How are we going to solve the fact that 40% of our country doesn't have $400 in the fucking bank to pay an emergency bill? How are we going to do X, Y, and Z? Instead, it's, oh my gosh, can you believe that the Steele dossier was leaked, and there may have been a meeting in the Czech Republic, or so and so may have met Julian Assange at the embassy here, and so, right? So whenever it. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And I was going to say, even regardless of that story, look what's going on that we were just literally talking about with Lil Nas X. Not only is Fox News talking about it constantly because it's good for ratings to drum up that kind of, that kind of anger with their audience and super Christian conservative people, but it's also just to distract from the issues, because it really doesn't matter, and it is just a dumb issue that's going on. You know what I mean? Like, of course they want to talk about that, because then people aren't talking about the ineptitudes of our government and about austerity politics and all that stuff.
Exactly. And what's even so crazy about this example that he chooses is that you actually could feasibly imagine a huge media story outbreak around, somebody's very public palimony case, right? So I just looked it up. I did not know what the fuck that was, but that's the dividing of financial assets up between an individual, right? So so palimony by definition means palimony is the division of financial assets and real property on the termination of a personal live-in relationship wherein the parties are not legally married. But if there was like some messy like mistress type situation with a billionaire and it got like super like seedy and salacious, you could totally see like E Entertainment and MSNBC and all these other people going like completely nuts about the like inner details of this guy's like finances and how much he has to pay off this lady and how much did he give to the other women and who was involved and all these other kinds of shit, where it was like literally the punchline of a fucking joke that you would have to be asinine, fucking crazy with nothing better to do to even entertain the thought of that, 50 years ago in the 70s.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And, people talk about, this was a point that I think was well made, which was, remember the Me Too movement, how well publicized that was? Well, there wasn't really as much of a Me Too movement within the restaurant industry, for example. Why? Because it wasn't profitable for all these news organizations to write headlines and run stories about how fill in the blank famous person was actually a horrible sexual monster. People know who Kevin Spacey is. People know who Bill Cosby is, for example. So of course it's going to be a huge story to run and talk about 24/7 for 6 months straight. But a lot of sexual abuse and harassment is going on in all industries. There's just not very famous people that have big names in those industries, so it's not profitable for CNN to run stories about 24/7.
Yeah. Or it's marginalized people that are, that they don't even want to give platforms to begin with, right? I mean, if you look at the ratio of like black trans women and sexual assault, right? I mean, it's astronomical, right? Yet and you look at the homicide rate amongst like black trans women, right? These kinds of things would never get reported because you're right. The profit motive just isn't there. Yet where there is the profit motive, you'll get something that's completely horseshit that nobody needs to know about.
Right. And not that the Bill Cosby story shouldn't have been covered in depth, but again, if it was just some random dude in some random industry, finance company or something that was that serial of a sexual harasser and assaulter, it wouldn't have gotten the news story because just no one knows who that is. He's not a celebrity. Again, our celebrity culture makes us care about people that have big names and big clout, regardless of who they are, even how much power they necessarily have. Again, Donald Trump and a lot of our people in power are also sexual assaulters and all that.
Joe Biden.
They face no consequences. Joe Biden, exactly. That's another great
Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah.
It's a long 100%. List. But yeah, we can move on to rule 3, which is hate people, not institutions. And this is so vital because this is exactly what they teach you to do, right? The enemy is the person next door who's watching Fox News or the person next door who's watching MSNBC, right? Not ever the cable news industry itself, not ever, whatever, right? So Trump is not just the perfect media product. He's a brilliant propaganda mechanism. Though most of our problems are systemic, most of our public debates are referendums on personality. Not many people can be neutral on the subject of Trump, so we wave him at you all day long. So exactly. So it's something that will draw a visceral reaction, right? Because of course, most people who we would define as like sane, compassionate individuals, you show them somebody and you say, this person's going to be the president of the United States. And then you look at the you show them like the Access Hollywood grab them by the pussy tape, or you show them like, all of these like deplorable characteristics, like when he calls like, Mexican immigrants rapists and, all the kind of things that he implied. All of those things make him completely odious and, unapproachable. But to another, on the flip side of that, right, there are people who love that about him, who, kind of view him as somebody who's like completely like, refusing to participate, as Matt Taibbi said, somebody who's not going to participate at all in the theater, who's not going to be a part of the pageantry, who actually is the antithesis of the pageantry, right? Instead of like performing a song, just going up and farting at the fucking, whatever, right? Like that's the kind of guy that he is, because he's like it was like his own like kind of like backwards protest, or at least that's how it was viewed to the people who were supporting him, right? And so it didn't matter. That the only thing that mattered to the cable companies and the cable news media was that these people were pitted against each other, right, and not against cable news as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, as long as this charade continues and as long as the media does just remain very personality centric and kind of it keeps engaging with this hate watching content, it really just enables the continual lowering and lowering of the bar because then, you rile up the MSNBC audience, for example, and talk about how terrible Trump is all day, every day, and get them furious. And then they're so furious that they accept Joe Biden. They're perfectly happy with someone who's going to sit there and his greatest accomplishment is just rolling back. Sorry, his greatest accomplishment is just rolling back everything that Trump did on day one and doing little of his own accord. So it's really just this bar lowering that will continually be enabled by this sort of coverage. Trump's so bad. And then the logical, conclusion to that is then the antidote is Joe fucking Biden. When in reality, of course, that's not the antidote to our crumbling system. We need systemic reform, not incrementalism, a la the neoliberalism of the Joe Biden administration.
Absolutely. And we can move on to the next one, which is everything is someone else's fault, which I just thought was a nice segue from the point that you were making, right? So here's how we create political news content. Something happens. It doesn't matter what. Donald Trump nominates Brett Kavanaugh. A hurricane hits Puerto Rico. The financial market collapses. Bill Clinton is impeached for perjury over a sex act. A massive humanitarian crisis hits Syria. Whatever it is, our task is to turn it into content, quickly running it through a flowchart. Bad thing happens. Can it be blamed on one or the other party? Yes, we do that story. No, we don't do the story. See Rule 5, which I wanted to quickly go into Rule 5 because it's important and a good follow-up.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
If both parties have an equal or near equal hand in causing a social problem, we typically don't cover it. Or better to say, a reporter or two might cover it, but it's never picked up. It doesn't take over a news cycle, doesn't become a thing because nothing is everyone's fault, right? And that is the fucking kicker, right? And that's why we talk about things like the Overton window, right? We talk about the scope of reality that we have in Congress, like who gets to set the parameters of debate. So initially the theory was, behind a Bernie Sanders campaign, right? When he launched his campaign, he obviously knew it was a huge long shot to win. But what he was trying to do was show the American people, and obviously he was also trying to win, but what he was also trying to do was show the American people that we can have these things, that these things are possible. He was going to articulate to them on a massive scale in what grew to be an astronomical scale, enough to change public opinion completely on issues like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, free college, things that had not even been thought about by anyone in our generation, right? But those things all had those things all have systemic solutions, right? Which is why Bernie Sanders, there was the whole Bernie blackout. He does it. They don't want to cover that. They didn't want to talk about Bernie Sanders because they have to come up with a response for why this isn't systemic. He doesn't meet their formula, right? So Fox News can cover Bernie Sanders all they want because he's crazy, blah blah blah, yada yada yada, right? But yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, it definitely is interesting. And I also think this is just such an interesting kind of, I guess, flowchart is what he calls it. But, bad thing happens. Can it be blamed on one or the other party? Yes, we do the story. No, we don't do the story. And I think that's just so indicative, too, of how a lot of the mainstream kind of very bifurcated press, partisan press works. We have the liberal press. Anything that the Biden administration, for example, does, they're immediately going to start defending it or talking about how Trump was worse. And, shouldn't we be glad that, now Biden is at least not that bad. And the same thing is the case for the other side of the aisle. So it really is a pathetic state of affairs, and it's not real journalism. It really is just clickbait and reinforcing everyone's preconceived notion, which is a large part of the reason why we are where we are. And that's another huge part of the whole hate Inc. equation is that, these media industries have arisen basically to confirm our biases, to confirm what we already believe to be true, because that in and of itself is addictive for people. It's almost, in a sense, you almost feel smarter when you're constantly reading content that affirms your own beliefs. People don't necessarily like to be challenged all the time. That can be uncomfortable intellectually.
Yeah, and that's why you see people melt down constantly, right? Yeah. Whenever they're and that's what we always point out on our show, right? Anybody that kind of melts down in a debate when they're pushed back, I mean, you can kind of tell that person's not coming. Yeah, they're not rooted in anything legitimate. They don't have these actual beliefs, right? And you can see all kinds of examples, right? For one, you could saw the squirming of Andrew Yang when Crystal Ball and Kyle Klinsky pressed him on BDS, right? They clearly knew what they were arguing, and they were like, and they knew why this was a just movement and why it was necessary. He knew that he'd been told that he had to be opposed to something, and it became immediately obvious, and he fell apart, and he squirmed, and he didn't have any answers, and he had a complete tonal shift, right? He was not the easygoing, oh, I'm interested in talking about ideas and getting into the weeds kind of guy. He completely shut down. That kind of thing reveals something, right? Where even when Gavin and I vehemently disagree on the podcast, we'll go back and forth about something for like 45 fucking minutes, even if it's relatively obscure and not important. Even when at the end it's like, wait, dude, so what do we disagree again? Because we actually give a shit about what we're talking about, and we will fight tooth and nail over fucking, minute things. And that's not to say you should always do that. Obviously, Gavin and I have been friends for a long time. We do this podcast together. We understand that we're looking and trying to talk about strategy. But that kind of discussion and that kind of pushback and breaking things down and being willing to call out all sides, being able to call out people that you once aligned yourself with, being able to call out opinions that you once held and championed when you realize that they're no longer viable. I mean, these kinds of things, this kind of self-reflection, this kind of analysis is completely absent in any kind of legacy cable news media.
Yeah, and just simply being able to admit that you were wrong too, and adjust to new information and new facts. Everyone is human, everyone is imperfect, and sometimes we all do get it wrong. We all make a miscalculation and then have to admit that we fucked up. There's really nothing wrong with that, and it really is a fault with the media at large too, is their inability to do that. Of course, with the whole Russiagate thing, just getting further emboldened and entrenched in this, dumb conspiracy, even though it's basically been proved wrong, with hosts like Joe Scarborough really digging in their heels. It's just indicative of that kind of culture and that, like you said, that lack of reflection. And that's really just contributed to this kind of poisoning effect.
Yeah, exactly. And you can look at the lack of introspection on the forever wars. There's another example, right? That's something that's everyone's fault, right? Obama is just as culpable in the drone strike expansion, taking us from like 2 wars to what was it, like 7 wars where we were when he left, and fucking something crazy. I mean, the blood is on his hands just as much as it is these other president, right? Because he could have gotten us out and he didn't, right? Same with Donald Trump, same with Joe Biden. They're all complicit in this, which is why you can't have what's truly deeply critical coverage about this honest reflection, and you probably won't for another 25 fucking years, if ever. But we can move on to the next rule.
And one last thing on that, what's crazy about that is obviously, there were some Democrats called out George Bush, although not enough Democrats, mind you, including John Kerry. Not enough Democrats, but some Democrats, tried to toe the anti-war line when it was Bush, but there was no semblance of that whatsoever under Obama. Basically complete silence on the war front. The anti-war activism was, nearly dead. And again, the drone strikes were continuing regardless. But ironically and hilariously, on the right wing, they were still criticizing Obama on his foreign policy, but still from a right wing perspective. They weren't saying, this is crazy. Why did you take it from 2 wars to 7? They were calling him impotent and saying that he had completely defunded and, demasculated our military and made us weak on the world stage. So they were still pressuring him from the right to increase the militarism, to have more forever wars.
Well, right, because it's kind of like what we were saying, right? The parameters of debate in this country are set by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And what the Republican Party does is they take their poll that sets their parameter of debate and they put it on the back of a fucking Corvette and ride off as fast as they can and make everything that even like just fucking astronomically conservative just bound to fail. I mean, Gavin and I were both residents of the failed Governor Brownback experiments of extreme austerity, right? These kind of crazy radical things that actually do get implemented in this country in really deep red states like Kansas. So what the Democratic Party should do, if they were trying to balance that out accurately, what they would do is, they would be forced to, I'm not saying drive off in the left as fast as you fucking can, but they need to be putting up a serious opposition if you're going to be, balancing each other out. You have to have, a true antidote, right? You have to, to the problems that are being given phony solutions, right? Because if somebody offers, a phony solution and versus like no solution, people are going to go with the phony solution. That's just the way that people are. And instead, what they do is they just plant their fucking flag in the middle of the road for no fucking reason and let the Republicans set the whole dialogue. But it's interesting. We'll get to one of the rules later where we find out that the whole news media actually runs on an inverted template of that logic.
Right, exactly. And do you want to go to rule 6?
Yeah, root, don't think. So by the early 2000s, TV stations had learned to cover politics exactly as they covered sports, a proven profitable formula. The presidential election especially was reconfigured into sports coverage saga. It was perfect. 18 months of scheduled contests, a preseason, straw polls, regular season, primaries, and playoffs, the general. Stadium events, a subgenre of data reporting. It's not an accident that the sabermetrics guru Nate Silver fits so seamlessly into political coverage, right? So he's not even close to right anymore, by the way. Just fucking Nate Silver. But it is exactly this. It has become a root, don't think kind of a deal. You know, this is the blue no matter who, whatever it is. It's always my team versus your team. Like, and a lot of people won't fess up to this, but it's true when you're really getting, and I remember this, admittedly from when I was like, a teenager in high school, right? And you don't really know your own opinions and you're just like, okay, feeling things out. And your first response is to be like, okay, well, what do the people that I agree with on other issues think about this issue when you yourself don't have a lot of information? That is not an irrational response. That is actually, but what happens is that they prey on that response. So any kind of person, when you don't know something, you think, who do I know that would know something about that? And obviously, if you're a Democrat, you're going to think that the Republican is like kind of credibly bankrupt. Like you're not going to take a lot of stock in what they're telling you about politics usually. And so then you would go and ask somebody that kind of confirms your belief system, right? It's not until you really invest in politics a lot of time usually that you're looking at the actual source material and able to draw your own conclusions before they've been kind of essentially spun for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, this is just such a great point that Taibbi is making here about the similarity with our sports and our politics here in the States. I've long, noticed the similarities between politics and sports, but this is such a great distillation of it. And it really is true that, we literally have a red team and a blue team. Those are like the teams you're divided up to in fucking elementary school when you're like playing hockey in PE class. Like it's really quite, insane the level to which the sportsification of politics has taken place, and absolutely someone like Nate Silver who gets it wrong would fit, of course, seamlessly into that, because it's exactly the same kind of commentary that goes on in sports. It's all just kind of meaningless, but it's still entertaining, and that's what keeps people coming back, this kind of addictive nature of it all. And it's a contest, of course it's going to keep people coming back. It's almost like America's Got Talent or something. You tune in every week, and someone gets the crew gets whittled down, if you're talking about a general election.
Survivor style.
The debate stage, it's like who's going to fuck up, and there's going to be embarrassing moments, and it is entertaining. I love it. I look forward to presidential elections. So I'm certainly guilty of this exact consumeristic behavior when it comes to media and this kind of content. But it's definitely true that it's a very uniquely American thing. In other countries, elections are not as long as they are here. They're very brief and they're very issue based. It's not this multi-year, 2-3 year long process of this reality show thing, and where looks are a huge deal, and personality, and who do you want to have a beer with, and all this horse shit. It's much more issue based, and it should be. Like I said, despite the fact that I personally have a guilty pleasure for a lot of this exact content which Taibbi is critiquing, it's certainly not productive for an American political electorate.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously that just comes down to the hyper capitalization of our society, and people have realized that there's money to be made here, and you accelerate that and it grows and whatever. But yeah, we can go ahead and move on to the next rule, number 7, which is no switching teams, which I think we can talk about. This has actually changed a little bit, but it does get back to the point that I was talking about where Roger Ailes and the idea of balance on TV news. So he says there's no switching teams. The symbolic moment when Paul Begala and Tucker Carlson were unable to find something nice to say about each other has since spilled into all news coverage. The concept of balance, which used to be considered a virtue, has been twisted all the way around to mean a taboo trade practice, a form of dishonesty. Roger Ailes at Fox started this. He made the whole concept of balance an inside joke on right-wing media. It's the reason the preposterous slogan fair and balanced was so effective for both recruiting conservative viewers and infuriating liberals. Ailes used to say, the news is like a ship. If you take your hands off the wheel, it pulls hard to the left. Translation, you need to pull hard the other way to achieve balance overall. So it's like he's making the exact same argument, right? However, it's horseshit, and I don't say that just because I'm a leftist. Capitalism and capital will always pursue the further of capitalism. So, and I think you could also say Roger Ailes and I define the term left differently.
Yeah.
To him, left is neoliberalism, which I think maybe the news will drift more towards neoliberalism. That's neither here nor there. It certainly won't drift towards the left.
And also, I mean, that's one way to look at it for sure. I was almost thinking of it more as he defines conservative as, the Fox News mentality, and the left is almost like the populist uprising that is potential without the blanketing effect of Fox News-esque propaganda, because issues like, a $15 minimum wage, for example, isn't even necessarily leftist. It's just populist. People on both sides of the issue want that. And if it weren't for the relentless propaganda of Fox News and other cable, media corporations, we probably would have it by now. So you could certainly look at it from the neoliberal sense, but also just, as far as populism itself.
Yeah, I just think, as far as a rule, if I had any criticism for this no switching teams thing, it's that the Democratic Party has actually remarkably embraced the concept of switching teams because they are so quick to embrace neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is kind of like the home for conservatives who did not, the never Trump conservative, right? So the Joe Scarborough, insert whomever that is going to what's his fucking name, Colin Powell, who they were parading around, or whoever else during the election cycle, as all these people have banded together to support Joe Biden, or they gave Joe Scarborough a show on MSNBC. These kinds of things I think are starting to shift, just because it's like it kind of creates another sort of like self-satisfaction for people who are liberals to be like, see, even this guy who used to be a Republican knows the Republicans are so crazy that he had to become a Democrat. It's the same way that they use people who like Rafe Dubin, who is obviously a fucking fraud. But he can go on and be like, I used to be a Democrat, bro, but then they got so crazy that I had to switch to being a conservative because that was the only rational way to go. And they love that kind of like narrative and that storyline, and they'll use it for a while. So I'm not sure if I had any pushback, that would be on the no switching teams thing. But as far as the context of the argument that he's making here, I think it rings perfectly true.
Yeah, that's definitely for sure. Do you want to move on to the next rule?
Yeah. The other side is literally Hitler, and this is something that's reached an apex under the Trump administration, right? Obviously there were things like this moving about during the Bush years from the left and during the Obama years from the right, but under the Trump years, I think it's safe to say that the media really took this and ran with it. But also, I guess it's true that you could say that from the left in Gavin and I were not consumers of the media in 2002 and 2003. We were 4 and 5 years old. But he makes the point that shortly after 9/11, Fox began a long streak atop the cable ratings. Beginning in the first quarter of 2002, the company would stay number one for over 15 years straight. A crucial part of its success was its reaction to 9/11. Post-attack America was afraid and needed someone to blame. Fox and its minions were more than happy to comply. They began using language about liberals that was extreme by even their own standards. Their fellow Americans, leading conservative thinkfluencers, told them, "We're not just lily-livered suck-ups who pretended to be enlightened. They were actually in league with Al-Qaeda, murderers, traitors, not wrong, but evil," right? So these seeds had been planted, and they were used to kind of demonize and vilify people like Michael Moore, who was obviously speaking out against the Iraq war at a time where it was incredibly dangerous and hostile to do so. People like, why am I blanking on everybody else that spoke out against the Iraq war right now?
I mean, a lot of people got canceled, even like the Dixie Chicks, they got canceled. They got called
exactly, yeah.
Saddam. Yeah.
With Jesse Ventura, there was a lot of people that in that early stage got canceled, and then we saw a resurgence of it definitely with Trump. And I guess in more, I guess what you would call liberal mainstream media, this became much more of a factor under Trump, which makes sense, right? Because it was George Bush even MSNBC went full hog into the Iraq war, right? Let's not pretend that they had any kind of even like remotely left coverage of that. So, but this idea that the other side is literally like Hitler or Hitler-esque. Yeah. I mean, think about how many comparisons between Trump and Hitler that have been,
or even on the other side of the aisle. I mean, the Republican or the conservatives are the first ones to point to the most brutal leftist dictators or leaders throughout history and say this is what the left is going to be, and evoke the worst communist countries that have suffered the worst throughout history. You know what I'm saying? Like they're the first.
Stalin.
Yeah, exactly. Or Venezuela or whatever is currently going on. They're also the first to, hyperbolize to that extent and point to the craziest example. So this is just something
as if the United States has no culpability in the economic constraints on Venezuela.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Exactly. And ironically, a lot of right wingers too will try to point to Hitler and pretend that he was a leftist and try to be like, well, Hitler was a communist or something, like, you know what I'm saying? So everyone tries to make their enemy out to be Hitler for sure.
Exactly, because he's just the enemy. It's like everybody, like he's the stand-in bad guy for American politics, right? Because he was, I mean, obviously he was deplorable, but it was also he checked all the boxes for what you have to be acceptable to hate in America, right? Like he didn't have any assets that America wanted. Like it wasn't profitable for them to negotiate with Hitler and let him be. Right. I'm just saying there have been a lot of fucking horrible ass people in the world that were doing unconscionable things, and the United States looked the other way because it was profitable for them to look the other way.
Plus, the main victims of Hitler were white people, which is something that is not pointed enough. But that's probably why that genocide is the one that gets talked about the most. While there's other ones that are never mentioned.
Right, like the Rwandan genocide, or
exactly. And of course, there were other non-white members of people that were in the Holocaust, but you never hear about them as much. The other ethnic groups, for example, that were victims of Hitler's genocide.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Jewish people identify as white, but
yeah. So I mean, sorry if I fucked that up, but
yeah, but I'm just saying, I understand. Yeah. We can go on to the next one. But anyway, so in the fight against Hitler, everything is permitted, right? So we kind of talked about this in the way that on our previous episode where Matt Taibbi was examining how journalists essentially changed the way that everything about the way that they did their job to make it if you opposed Donald Trump, which was a lot of people in the news media, then you would spin every piece that you had in order to make sure that it was a clear takeaway that Donald Trump was bad, right? So people often quote him as saying, like, instead of 24 hours a day of Donald Trump, it was 24 hours a day of Trump is bad. And so he goes on to say that that Cohen's take on Crossfire was right. The early stage TV battles depended for their success on a propaganda trick. The networks clearly didn't want to encourage constructive political activism, so the fight always involved a ferocious, deregulation-mad, race-baiting right-winger pounding the crap out of a spineless, backpedaling centrist masquerading as a leftist. Cohen's fairness and accuracy in reporting did a field guide to TV's lukewarm liberals that explained how this works, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to get into all this. This is two more of the quote. But essentially, the idea that he's getting at is that, all this mudslinging, all this, changing the formula for everything on both sides, they justify it by saying that, this monstrosity that we're up against is just so evil. It's so destructive that everything is allowed in the fight against it. It's kind of like the same thing that he was saying with terrorism, right? Like, think about how much of our fucking liberties we gave up in the name, we didn't give it up, but the fucking people in power when we were children gave up our liberties through things like the Patriot Act, right? It's whatever drives fear then drives submission.
Yep. And just like with the Russiagate stuff, like I was saying earlier, if you actually believed the full extent of those charges, you would think that, our democracy was compromised, that the results of the election were invalid, and that we were living basically in an illegitimate or under an illegitimate presidency. And of course, if you truly believe that, then that warrants all kind of crazy actions. I mean, that warrants the kind of actions that we saw people taking under the same exact delusion that they had been led to by Newsmax and Fox News and all these right-wing outlets that, again, their election had been stolen, that they were living in a fake democracy. And a lot of that is out of genuine ignorance, not to excuse people that, of course, took place in the insurrection or people that egged on the Russiagate theories. But if you take the media at its word, and of course we're told in our education and schools to take the media at their word, then of course that's going to inspire a pretty crazy reaction, a pretty crazy backlash from the populace, which again is why it's pretty crazy that those kind of claims are just made unchecked on TV.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the final rule kind of puts a great bow on that point, which is you have it down here. And I don't, and it all boils down to that the idea of both of these news stations is to make their audiences feel superior, right? So, in the idea is, yeah. So he says it's not an accident that Trump won the presidency on winning and spent much of his political career calling people losers, from Cher to Richard Belzer to Graydon Carter to Rosie O'Donnell to George Will to Michelle Malkin. Trump sells the vicarious experience of being a winner compared to other schlubs. His lack of empathy is often cited as evidence of narcissistic sociopathy, and maybe it is, but it's a chicken and egg question. Was he always like this, or did he become more this way? Because among his other weaknesses, he's clearly addicted to the worst kind of political media. When you look back at the generation of Heather's style coverage, the evolution towards Trump starts to make more sense. We can excuse almost anything in America except losing, and we love a freak show. Trump was the best of both worlds. As far as the press was concerned, an Agnew-style attacker on the one hand, and a lurid and disgusting monster free for audiences to look down on the other. There was no better commercial situation for the American media than a president about whom a porn star can write, "I had sex with that." I'd say to myself, "Eck."
Yeah, and that's a great
pretty good
reminder
summation of where our politics is, right? No matter who you are, you're getting news that makes you feel better about yourself. You're getting news that inflates your ego. If you're a liberal, you're looking down at the basket of deplorables, right? You're looking down at all these white trash scumbags, blah blah blah. You're turning your nose up at them. And if you're watching Fox News and you're looking at all these stuck up liberals, or all these people who don't want to work for a living, or all these immigrants, or whoever they're fucking targeting your anger at that moment from Fox News. But it's that whole same thing on both sides, and it's all about inflating your ego, because that's what makes people go back. And also, when people feel good about themselves, it makes it easier to sell advertisements to them, which is essentially what this all boils down to.
Yeah, and it's a great point too. Bringing up Rosie O'Donnell, who I almost forgot about. That's such a throwback to the early days of Trump when he was hardcore beefing with Rosie O'Donnell. But that was another reason why the media had such a heyday with Trump. Similarly to what I was saying about how the Me Too movement was bigger in Hollywood than it was in other industries, because everyone knows who those celebrities are. The media loved Trump because he had all these high profile beef with other celebrities. So of course that's going to generate a bunch of clicks and stories, because people love that drama. People love the beef between someone like Rosie O'Donnell and a personality like Donald Trump or Cher or Madonna, or all of these, personalities that he beefed with over the course of his campaign and even into his presidency. That was the media's, wet dream, was covering that kind of shit. And it was really the perfect kind of symbiotic relationship between Donald Trump and the media. That's something we've talked about at length.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a pretty good place to wrap this discussion. Essentially, those were the 10 rules of hate laid out by Matt Taibbi, and I think it paints a pretty good picture of kind of the structure of not only what a lot of people are dealing with as consumers of media, but also the structure of how legacy media, and specifically cable news, creates their content, right? That the breakdown that he provided of, can this be blamed on one specific group that's not our audience? Yes, great, let's report on it. No, fuck it, we can't sell that to people, right? And I listened to Matt Taibbi. He did a great interview with Jordan Sheridan over at Status Q. People should go check it out, where he talked about how the reason that a story like Flint water crisis doesn't get covered is because you just can't show people that emotionally move them and then try and get them to buy like a fucking new PlayStation 5. Like, that's just not the kind of or go get them to fucking want to buy a fucking McDonald's cheeseburger, right? You want them to be feeling good, or if you want them feeling bad, you want them feeling bad in like a specific way that's not making them like think critically, right? More like doubting themselves and hating themselves for whatever reason, right? Those two kind of things fly, but nothing that could actually inspire actual
which is why you don't often hear stories reported on about real environmental destruction and everything, but you will constantly hear about how you can make yourself feel better by using a reusable straw or stuff like that, which isn't actually going to solve the problem, but it's marketable to you. They can make money off of it and sell you that hope.